Good evening, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome back to Hilaal Live. My name is Faraz Patel. I would like to thank you, the viewer, for staying with us. Now, the area of Craighall has been one of the areas in Johannesburg that have been hit with 12-hour power cuts as Eskom continues to implement load shedding, with the current stages of 5 and 6 taking into effect. What this means is that for the duration of time that has the effect of being in stage 8, and this is something that Electricity Minister Dr. Josiento Ramokgopa has continually denied. Now, one such person that experienced 12 hours of power cuts is energy analyst Chris Yelland, and he joins me on Zoom. Mr. Yelland, good day, and thank you so much for joining us here on Hilaal Live.
Thank you for having me, and welcome to your listeners.
Right, Mr. Yelland. 12 hours. On paper, that would constitute stage 8. Am I right? What are the other factors that constitutes stage 8 load shedding?
Now, look, stage 8, if you look at the standard known as NRS 048-9, this is a document that is prepared by the electricity industry, particularly Eskom and municipalities, which lays down the rules and protocols around load shedding, and it defines these 8 stages of load shedding, and it indicates how many hours per day is relevant to the different stages, whether it is stage 1 or 2 or 3 or whatever. Now, obviously, as the stages increase, so the length of power outages increases. And if you study it carefully, you will notice that that stage 8 load shedding is actually 10 hours of load shedding per day. Now, Eskom and municipalities do this load shedding in 2.5-hour stretches. It's actually 2-hour stretches, but they add an extra half an hour per stretch, making it 2.5 hours, in order to give them a bit of leeway in terms of getting out there to switch on and off. So if you look at 5 stretches of 2 hours, that's 10 hours a day, and 5 stretches of 2.5 hours a day, that's 12.5 hours. Now, that is what stage 8 load shedding looks like. Now, what is experienced in Johannesburg, the city of Johannesburg, and by the way, in many other municipalities too, not just Craighall, where I live, but in many municipalities around South Africa, during the last stage 6 load shedding over the last weekend, I personally experienced 12.5 hours of load shedding on a particular day. 5 stretches of 2.5 hours. And that is corresponding to stage 8. Now, the minister assures us that only stage 6 load shedding was implemented, and it's correct in the sense that Eskom, the system operator, gives a command. When you're going into stage 6, it issues a command to all customers and municipalities, because municipalities are Eskom customers, to shed load equivalent to stage 6. So let us just say the city of Johannesburg is given a command to shed 300 megawatts. How they do it, the system operator is not concerned. Whether they have 4 stretches or 5 stretches or 6 stretches or whatever they do, all they've got to do is reduce their demand by the amount that the system operator works out for stage 6. Recently, the city of Johannesburg took over the load shedding that was previously done by Eskom for the Johannesburg metropolitan area. And so now it's up to City Power Johannesburg to work out its own schedules and to perform the load shedding operations. The thing is this: Joburg announced that they would, in fact, give an easier ride to commercial and industrial customers. So when you're on stage 6 load shedding, Instead of doing stage 6 load shedding for commercial and industrial, they might give them a lesser burden of, let's say, stage 4 load shedding. But that means in order to meet the command from system operator, the other customers in the city, like me and many other residential consumers, will suffer an increased level of load shedding like stage 8, because it's a zero-sum game. All that if you give one group of customers an easy ride, you have to give another group of customers a more severe ride, so that in total you are meeting the requirements of the system operator, and that is what is happening. So yes, Eskom was issuing a stage 6 command, but City Power and other municipalities, in their wisdom, have decided to give certain customer classes an easy ride and others a more difficult ride. And that's why we are experiencing, not just me, but many people throughout South Africa have been complaining to the system operator. Why are they being load shedding at a severity greater than stage 6? And that's the reason.
Chris, Mr. Yelland, last week, and do correct me if I'm wrong, because it is something that boggled my mind when the minister said that a lot of this is caused by the heat waves. So, I mean, in winter, obviously, it'd be caused by the cold weather. Various reasons would be given there. But one would assume that in summer, the highest stages of load shedding would not occur. Why is it happening in summer? Because I think it's a question that every single citizen of this country wants to get an answer on.
Yeah. Well, one may think intuitively that there's going to be higher load shedding in winter because demand for electricity is higher in winter. And in summer, demand for electricity is less, therefore you'd expect less load shedding. But one only has to look back each year for the last few years to realize that, in fact, load shedding in summer is very common. In fact, the very first time South Africa ever experienced stage 6 load shedding was in the middle of December 2019, in the middle of summer. You may remember the president was recalled from Egypt, where there was an African Union meeting, and he had a media briefing, and he promised that they were going to do something about it. So it's not unusual to have load shedding in summer, but your question is why? And I'm going to try and answer it. Firstly, you've referred to the hot weather, and I want to explain that certain of Eskom's largest power stations, and in particular, to mention their names, Majuba Power Station, Matimba Power Station, Medupi, and Kusile Power Stations, are what is known as dry, air-cooled power stations. In other words, they use the ambient air, and they have fans, and they blow this air through like a radiator in order to cool the condensate that is coming out of the steam turbines. Now, obviously, in the middle of summer, when you have a heat wave, and in these areas in Limpopo, for example, where Matimba and Medupi are, and in Mpumalanga, temperatures were extremely hot, typically 40 degrees. So the amount of cooling is not the same as in cooler months. And this means they have to operate the power stations at a reduced output. Now, in technical jargon, this is known as increased partial load losses. In other words, the power stations and the generators in the power stations cannot run at full load. They have to reduce the load because of the reduced cooling. And that plays a role. Now, that's not the only reason, but it certainly accounts for about one stage of load shedding, the hot weather. Now, I must also just quickly add that we should not use the hot weather as an excuse. Eskom knows very, very well that in summer, these power stations produce less electricity than in winter or in cooler weather. It is absolutely normal to have hot weather at this time of year. And the power system should be resilient enough to cater for the normal variations in weather, even hot weather, even cold weather, even windy weather, even wet, rainy weather. And these should not be excuses why we have load shedding. They are the reasons why we sometimes have load shedding, but the point is, the real reason is Eskom's plant is performing so poorly. There's so many unplanned breakdowns that we're in a situation where there's no generation reserve capacity. And so when you have this hot weather, instead of having a bit of safety buffer with some reserve margin, you're suddenly plunged into a higher level of load shedding. So that explains the hot weather situation. But there are other issues that occurred at the same time, and that is that Eskom had been running these power plants very hard, and they didn't have, and a lot were broken down, and they had to run their emergency open cycle gas turbines. These are these diesel-driven turbines, as well as their pump storage schemes, which are normally only intended for emergency use for peaking. And they're not intended to run continuously during the day for production purposes. But when Eskom run out of generation capacity because too much is broken down, they do run these unit hard, and they were never intended, and they don't have sufficient storage, both water storage and diesel storage, to operate continuously. So when you operate them for at high levels, many hours a day, they run out of diesel or they run out of water in the dams in the case of the pump storage schemes. And then you have to switch them off, and you have to fill up with diesel, and you have to pump up the water from the bottom dam to the top dam to create, it's like topping up a battery. And to do this, you have to have space to do this. And it pushes us into a higher stage of load shedding. So we went from stage 4 to stage 6 over the weekend, so that Eskom had enough time and space to fill up its diesel tanks, which had run dry, and also to fill up the top water dams of the pump storage schemes. There are a few other reasons, but those are the main reasons why we had stage 6 load shedding: the weather, and to replenish the emergency reserves.
Mr. Yelland, unfortunately, that's all the time we have. You. Thank you so much for joining us here on Hilaal Live.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me on your show.
Absolute pleasure. That's Chris Yelland, energy analyst. And as we, at this very moment, still stage 6 load shedding continually to haunt the country, and that, of course, is followed up by stage 5 during the daytime. Yeah, we are truly living in these dark times, and we hope that, of course, it does change ahead of the holiday season. Do stay tuned to Hilaal Live. I'll be back after this break.